Hey there, what's up everybody? I hope you all have had a great week. It is so great to see you again. So this week's video is going to be structured just a little bit differently, but to start out, I want you to get in your mind your favorite story of the most grossed out that you have ever been. I'm certain that we all have a story of the worst smell that we've ever had to endure, or the pipe that busted once upon a time, and we had to clean up all sort of who knows what. And maybe you were hunting, ruptured the stomach or the bowels of whatever it was you're hunting, and as you were getting rid of that, you had to deal with that absolutely awful, awful smell. There's so many things in life that gross us out. We have to get through it sometimes, and we may act tough, we may act like it's not bothering us, but when that gag reflex hit, it's totally game over. I don't usually make it a habit of quoting Sigmund Freud, but I came across this quote, and it was pretty good. He said that a man who will kiss a pretty girl's mouth passionately may perhaps be disgusted by the idea of using her toothbrush. So this week, we're going to talk about an emotion that I actually didn't even know was an emotion. We're going to talk about disgust. So let's get into it. Like I said, I knew that disgust was a thing, but I didn't know that it was considered an emotion. Simply put, disgust is a feeling of aversion towards something offensive. If you look it up in the dictionary, you'll find that disgust is a marked aversion that is aroused by something highly distasteful. Looking at the broader family of emotions that relates to disgust, we find that it ranges from dislike to loathing. But we know something gross when we see it, right? It can be one of those things that we know, but we can't always describe or put words on until we see it. A lot of times, we may not really have the words to describe the things that disgust us, or we may not be able to point them out in the moment. So, a few things that trigger disgust. The universal trigger of this emotion is feeling that something is offensive, that's poisonous or contaminating. You can feel disgusted by something that is perceived with your five senses. You can be disgusted by something that you taste or you smell or that you have to touch. And so some of these triggers are physically perceived, the five senses. Some of those are more universal, while other things that trigger us can be culturally and individually influenced. So for example of this, bodily fluids like blood and those types of things are more universally disgusting for us as humans, while certain types of food are more culturally learned to find those things disgusting. Some examples of common triggers for disgust are things that are rotting, diseased, or dying. Animals, or things that one finds physically ugly. Also, we can find things disgusting. We can find perceived perversion or acts of other people. And so these last couple of examples are interesting because it turns out that we can also be disgusted by people, actions, or ideas. So disclaimer, I'm not promoting that we go around celebrating this thing as disgusting or using it as an excuse to mistreat people. Absolutely not. But disgusting is interesting because it's an emotion that's not present at birth. It's actually developed between the time that we are 4 and 8. It develops with us as we age from there. Children and adolescents have a higher intrigue and a fascination for disgusting things, and I think that this really explains teenage boys a lot. They find a lot of things super fascinating that are incredibly disgusting. So how is disgust expressed? A lot of times we may express disgust vocally. We may give a hearty, yeah, or that's gross, that was nasty, or yuck. Voice might jump an octave or do all kinds of things, and all these vocal expressions might be followed by some choking, gagging. Like I said, when that gag reflex kicks in, it's game over. Along with the vocal response, we may have another physical response where we may have a revulsion in our mouth, our throat, and in our stomach, along with possible nausea and this real physical repulsion. In other words, when we start gagging and begin to vomit when we come into contact with something that disgusts us, our bodies are actually starting a response, and they're actually responding by trying to get rid of whatever this thing is and to get us away from it, to keep us safe. The basic function of disgust is to keep us away from, to block off, or to eliminate something that is toxic, offensive, or contaminating. Disgust is meant to keep a separation between us and the things that threaten us, that we may not view as or we may not see as a threat. These It's meant to keep us away from these things that threaten us that may not actually trigger a fear response. So disgust we see as an emotion that occurs in us naturally. It is biologically intended to keep us safe. And there are ways to describe the things that disgust us. Things that are toxic, people and ideas can actually all be sources of our disgust. That's great. But what do we begin to do with this knowledge, and what examples are there to teach us how to respond to this emotion in a proper manner? Let's jump into the Bible and see what we can find there that might help us figure out how we need to handle this disgust and how to handle this emotion. Disgust is only mentioned in one verse in the entire Bible in the book of Psalms. It is never used in the Gospels or in any description of an emotion that Jesus had. Psalms 119, 158, that one place in the Bible, says that I look at the faithless with disgust because they do not keep your commands. While the Bible never directly talks about Jesus being disgusted, I do really think that Jesus pushed beyond a feeling of disgust many times. You see, Jesus was ridiculed by the Pharisees for associating with publicans, with sinners and prostitutes and Samaritans. All of these groups were morally repugnant to the Jews in the first century AD. Like we talked about, disgust can come at the actions or appearances of people. So Jesus associated with people on a regular basis who were culturally disgusting in his time. I think that Jesus experienced this emotion a good deal throughout his ministry, but the compassion that he felt in himself for individuals was way stronger than this aversion to stay away from people. Jesus put himself into the lowest position of a servant in the story where he washed the disciples' feet. Caked with dust, grime, sweat, calluses, blisters, and blood, and anything else that the disciples may have stepped in, these feet were disgusting. On top of all that, they're still feet and are disgusting in their own right when they're even clean. Jesus stooped down and washed each pair of the disciples' feet to show that his love was so deep for his closest disciples. There's a really interesting tidbit about disgust in that the intimacy that is shared with an individual will actually lower the threshold of what is considered disgusting in our minds and disgusting in ourselves long enough for us to help the individual. In that same vein, intimacy, love, and community can all be strengthened when the disgust that we feel towards something is suspended in service to an individual. The psychologist and emotion researcher Paul Ekman cautions against a danger in disgust when it comes to having disgust towards other people. This emotion can actually lead us to avoid entire groups and certain groups of people. We can begin to avoid and degrade those that may be deemed as morally or physically disgusting, and this is not a good thing. We read in the Bible and that our example that Jesus regularly acted in such a way that he did not allow a feeling of disgust to hinder his mission or his care for the people around him. Another disgusting story from the Gospels is when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. When Lazarus came out of the tomb, this dude still had the grave clothes wrapped around him. This guy had been dead for 4 days. They didn't have cold cellars or embalming back then, so this guy's body was stinking, and it was in the beginning stages of decomposition. Those grave clothes had to have been smelling bad and have that decaying flesh all soaked into. It was gross. But Jesus also had multiple interactions with lepers who had open wounds and sores all over them. They even had whole limbs that probably had rotted off. Jesus went among the sick and the contagious on a regular basis. He roamed among the blind and all that were considered at that time to be way beyond worthy of being avoided. This potential danger, this danger of this emotion of disgust, if this emotion goes unchecked, it can be applied culturally. It can be taught to apply to certain people groups. And in the Gospels, in our example, we see Jesus working against this force and going beyond this danger. So while the Gospel writers may not have directly described Jesus as being disgusted, we see Jesus in situations where he would be experiencing this emotion. Yet we see him operating in a manner that was contrary to this emotion. So let's shift this. We have a little bit of an example in how we need to handle this emotion of disgust. How does it come into our day-to-day lives? How does it apply to us? Well, we as men, unfortunately, are considered to have more unsanitary habits and to be nastier than women. This is entirely very much a generalization, but men are considered to be disgusting creatures. Even if that truly is the case, we still, as disgusting creatures, get disgusted by things too. Just take a quick minute and think of the most disgusting thing that can happen to you. Think of that story that I had you think of at the beginning. You see, having to eat certain things in our culture is disgusting, and certain traditions for men, we would have to eat certain organs of animals when we killed them, and I find that incredibly disgusting. I think of a story that I've heard a couple of times where a couple that was in a foreign country was visiting with some locals and having dinner with some people they had met. Well, this couple was given a dish to eat, and in this culture, it would have been a major offense to decline this dish. So without pressing, the couple pushed through and ate the dish without asking what it was. They made it through. Later, they had the opportunity and asked another friend from that region what it actually was that they ate. The couple learned that what they had eaten was sheep's eyeballs. And the thought of that makes me gag every time. I do not think that I could get through something like that. We as men still get disgusted. Blood makes some of us cringe and recoil, and we just don't like to deal with it. We can get disgusted by the attitudes of others. I know I get disgusted when I have to clean hair out of a drain. These things happen to us. We have this emotion. And the biggest point of application from this lesson around this emotion is I think that it would help us the most if we would develop an awareness of the things that we have an aversion to become better at identifying the things that make us want to put some distance between us and whatever that thing is. By recognizing disgust in ourselves, we can begin to zero in on the things that we don't like. We can begin to identify the things and focus on the things that we try to get away from. This new recognition can lead us to ask more questions that will lead us deeper into why we want to get away from those things. There are some of us, and there are those of us that may not want to go know why something disgusts us, or we don't want to go deeper into that. But even in that moment, even for those of us that don't want to go deeper, then building this recognition will cause us to start seeing it in more places. It would be like when we go and we buy a new car. We do the research and we buy this new car. And then when we drive it off the lot, we think we're unique and that we're special. And then we start seeing that same exact car everywhere. This is known as the frequency illusion. We start seeing the thing that we have paid attention to more because we pay attention to it. This happens with disgust too. When we start recognizing the disgust in our lives more, we see it because we pay more attention to it. It actually isn't occurring any more than it was before. We're just more aware of it and see it in places where we didn't recognize it. That blue Miata has been sitting in the corner of the parking lot at work has always been sitting there. We just never paid attention to it. Shifting a little bit to a spiritual side of things, our recognition of moral disgust, or the ideas that disgust us, are going to lead to some challenges to us. It's going to lead to challenges of suspending that disgust for the better of others. If we're to follow in Jesus' example in the Gospels, then we have to be willing to be and able to suspend this emotion of disgust that causes us to put a constant distance between ourselves and the homeless, the worst sinners around us, the corrupt businessmen, the unjust judges in our area, the sick, the emotionally broken. We have to suspend or temper this emotion to get close enough to these individuals to care for them. An example of this from the Gospels were tax collectors in the first century. These individuals were essentially Jewish contractors that had sold out their own people to work for the Roman government. They were reviled. They were seen as immoral. They were viewed as disgusting by both men and women in that age. Jesus actually made one of these tax collectors one of his 12 closest disciples, one of those disciples that he washed his feet. See, once we have shown that we care, then we have the opportunity to begin to work in building these others into disciples. This emotion of disgust is intended to keep us safe. But if we let it control how we live and who we associate, then we are going to live isolated and bitter lives. On the other hand, though, if we surrender this emotion to God, He can use it to guide us. He's most likely going to call us out to go beyond our feeling of disgust. But we have to go out in faith and let Him keep us safe when we ignore this emotion. Greater connection, understanding, and confidence can come into a relationship when we push beyond disgust. So let's do a little bit of a recap of this emotion that's not as well known. And I really didn't know that this one was an emotion beforehand, but this has been kind of fun to get into. So disgust is an emotion that causes us to put distance between ourselves and something that's harmful or contaminating. It's a defense mechanism in our bodies. As our example to look to, Jesus dealt with disgusting ideals, people, and things. History had a lot of gross things in it. We really live in a great time. Jesus is our example of how to reach beyond disgust. Bringing that back to us now, knowing that what disgusts us can actually allow us to see the line of where our disgust is a matter of protection versus where it is a matter of keeping us closed off. As we become more aware of this emotion, we can build and deepen relationships with others by going beyond our emotion of disgust in order to care for someone, which actually consequently is also a part of being a trustworthy man. We want to care for one another, and suspending disgust is going to allow us to be able to do that better. So our question for this week, I just have one question again this week, and I want to leave this with you to think about as you go throughout the rest of the week. So what is an idea that has been presented to you in this past week that was so far out of your beliefs that you mentally gagged a little bit? I want to think on that, see if you can identify an idea that you thought probably was disgusting, that you might not have thought it was disgusting beforehand. So thank you all for joining in and watching this video this week. I hope that you didn't get too disgusted following along. Hope I didn't trigger any of that disgust in you. And I hope that you all have a wonderful week and that this will help you to identify some areas of disgust in your day-to-day interactions. I'm praying for you all, and may God keep you and bless you.